Good evening. This is the continuing edition of Operation City on a Hill. This is a series that I started on Champlain Valley cable television station. Due to scheduling issues, my own scheduling issues, I'm no longer able to meet the schedule to go and tape the show. And plus, they're not taping now anyway because of the COVID-19. So I am continuing this series here at home on Zoom. And this show tonight is going to be called The Crisis of Truth. The follow-up on the previous show I did, the last show I did on Champlain Valley cable television. That show was entitled Creation, Spirituality, and the Breastplate of St. Patrick. Now that was right around St. Patrick's Day, so we did it in honor of St. Patrick's. But the main theme of the was that the idea that reality came about as a creative act of free will is what gave dignity to the human person, as opposed to human beings just being simply a small cog in this vast cosmic drama. So this notion is what eventually gave rise to the idea of human rights. That human beings have a dignity and they should be afforded rights because of that dignity. Now, the idea of human rights is being associated in some people's minds simply with Western civilization. And some people, we're going to talk about that. Is it really just a Western civilization phenomenon, or does it have universal roots? Because there are some thinkers who prefer a more authoritarian system that are saying that this is a Western construct that they're trying to apply as universal and impose it upon other people. Now, personally, I think that this is a snow job that people are throwing up there to justify authoritarian control over their own people. But we're going to go into that. I'm going to start out with, I was watching a show the other day, a YouTube, actually it was a YouTube video where there was this guy that they were interviewing, a young guy. He went to school in America and he grew up in America, but his parents were from the former Soviet Union. And he had studied, recently, he had been studying the thinking of a gentleman by the name of Alexander Dugin. Now, Dugin is a Russian traditionalist thinker, and his claim to fame is he's been referred to as Putin's brain. That a lot of the thinking of Vladimir Putin has its origins in the thought of Alexander Dugin. Now, some people make the claim that, well, Putin is no one's puppet. He's not just following what, like a body that is someone else's brain for. And that's probably calling Dugin Putin's brain as if he was just blindly following what Dugin wants. Is maybe overstating the case, but it is, I think, beyond question, Dugin's thought in general has a large influence in what is called Russian traditionalism. Now, I want to touch a little bit upon what his argument is. He's basically talking about the post-World War II order in the United Nations and the imposing, in his view, of Western concepts of truth on the rest of the world, and that as if they were universal truths. And that, so he's saying that, well, you believe in human rights, you believe in a certain view of the family that is more expansive than the traditional view of the traditional family. You believe in a lot of these things that we don't believe in. So you have these UN courts of law and UN World financial organizations that won't deal with people unless they play ball by your rules, and you're imposing those rules on the rest of the world, when the rest of the world doesn't necessarily believe in the same ideas and not values that you have. And so you're imposing a unitary order on the world, as if Western civilization is the only thing that matters, and the rest of us, either we fall in line or we give up our civilization. Now he's referring to a pluralistic civilization, and initially, that's the argument they're making when they're critiquing Western civilization. At least that's the argument that this young gentleman that was characterizing Dugin's thought. But I've looked into some of it myself, and Dugin actually has some admiration of the previous early fascist thought. He critiques it, but he believes it represents traditionalism. So I don't think he has a problem with someone imposing their views on the rest of the world, as long as it was their views are being imposed. As a matter of fact, Putin himself had made the argument that the fall of the Soviet Union was the most catastrophic geopolitical event in his lifetime, or maybe ever, or for a long period of time. So they didn't have a problem with the imposition. The Soviet Union was clearly out to impose its ideology on the rest of the world. And ironically enough, that ideology comes from Russian traditional thought. It was Marxist-Leninist ideology that was materialistic at its core. And the critique of some of these traditionalists of modern American culture is it is materialist at its core, and it doesn't have a soul to it, a spiritual soul. There's no spirituality to it, so that it is destructive to traditional thought. And interestingly enough, there are others who have a similar view of Western culture and Western civilization that I will go into a little bit later. One of them, most famously, is Said Qutb, who was an Egyptian Islamist thinker, who is the main ideological guru for a lot of the Islamic jihadists who are fighting a jihad against Western civilization. We'll go into his thought a little bit. But I want to take a look at Dugin's idea, or at least the characterization of his idea by this guy who I'm not sure. I haven't read Dugin's own writings, but I have read excerpts from it, and I have seen excerpts on it, and I'm got the impression that this young Russian college, recently graduated college student, is whitewashing a little bit of Dugin's desire for pluralism. Now, but the main argument that he was presenting is that the American attempt, and he sees America as the main source behind this, is America is like the engine of Western civilization, where Europe used to be. America is now. The American attempt to oppose his views on the world is resulting in the destruction of other cultures. And so it is this cultural, a claim of cultural universalism that has a beef against. And they're claiming that the source of that universalism is modern materialistic values. And these values are detrimental to the transcendent spiritual values of traditional cultures. And interestingly enough, if you go back a little bit earlier, there was an Italian communist thinker named Antonio Gramsci, who had a similar view, only his understanding of the source of Western thought was a little bit different, and I think more historically accurate. His argument is that the Western civilization has its roots in what holds it together is the transcendent values of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And he was a Marxist Leninist. I don't know if he was a Leninist. He was definitely a Marxist. I don't know to what extent he followed Lenin. He was born in the late 19th century, 1890 something. He died in 1930 something. And his argument was that the Marxist Leninist, too, Lenin was even more strident about this revolution, violent revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie, Western civilization, the capitalist class. And they were going to try to incite this workers' revolution. And he had a couple of different arguments of why that wasn't going to work. One was that the West would respond back and to an obvious attempt to overthrow its civilization. And number two is that the workers themselves aren't going to fight back and take up arms against their fellow citizens who happen to be of the capitalist class, because something more fundamental holds them together than economic class considerations, and that is cultural, the unity of the Judeo-Christian culture and these transcendent values. So his argument is that you have to undermine the hegemony of the Judeo-Christian foundation, cultural foundation behind Western civilization, if you're going to have this revolution. So his argument was that you're going to have what has been referred to when people have what they refer to as cultural Marxism, a long march through the institution of Western culture to get rid of the idea of transcendent moral values. Anything that has any truth to it has got to be justified or accounted for by the experimental sciences. And this comes right out of Marxist dialectical materialism. Now, not all of the materialists were Marxists. There's groups called logical positivism. You have a bunch of groups, but what they all had in common was the idea that transcendent moral and spiritual truths that are of the type you get from religion are illusionary, and that you can believe what you want, but they don't have the quality of truth to them. The only truth that you can make a claim to is truth that can be accounted for by the methods of the physical sciences. And this worldview even seeped into, you had thinkers like B.F. Skinner, great behavioral psychologist. I don't know if I would consider him great, but he was very influential. At least he was influential. Whether he's great is another question. But he had made the argument, so did a lot of the others, that if you're going to apply the scientific method to human behavior, you got to assume the human being is not free. And this is an argument that is being made, that had been being made as a result of applying the physical disciplines. If you're gonna psychology, the human sciences, if they're gonna have a validity to them, a claim to be pursuit of truth, then they have to conform to the disciplines of physical sciences. It's not like the earlier traditions like Plato and the Greek philosophical tradition was more compatible with religious tradition because they believed in transcendent moral and values. There was a transcendent reality behind the nature. As a matter of fact, groups like the Saracen civilization and what is called the Islamic Golden Age, early Christianity and a lot of parts of Christianity and Hellenistic Judaism integrated Greek philosophy because they found not all of it, but certain elements of Greek philosophy to be compatible with the transcendent religious worldview. And so there are elements of philosophy and religion that can be compatible and that have staked the claim to universalism that is not limited to one particular culture. This has transcended a lot of different cultures. We will look into that too. I would make the argument that a rejection, and this is what we're seeing in some of these, in the name of cultural diversity and the respecting of other people's cultures, you're rejecting the idea of universalism. So you get rid of cultural hegemony and you're gonna have more diversity. My argument is that although the target might be Western civilization, the actual target, the intended target of Western civilization, the actual target ends up being culture itself, because no traditional culture believes none of the great religious traditions which became the foundation of culture believes that their culture is relative, that they all believe that there is a universal truth. As a matter of fact, there was a book by, I think it's C.S. Lewis. I think he wrote a book called The Abolition of Man, and he talked about the logos. In Greek is logos, in Chinese philosophy is called Tao. And it's a universal transcendent reality that the physical world is a manifestation of. And these are ideas that are compatible with religious, but it comes from philosophy, ancient classical philosophy. And you have the equivalent in Indian Hinduism and the Buddhist equivalent. You have these ideas that there is a transcendent reality. It's like the veil beyond. If you pull back the veil, there's something beyond the veil of the material world. The material world is a manifestation of something deeper and more profound, and that is pretty common in understanding religious traditions. And there is one view. I'm trying to think of his name. There's a Jewish scholar, Abraham Heschel, I think his name is. He wrote a book called God in Search of Man, a Philosophy of Judaism. He made the argument is that from the standpoint of the world of phenomena, cause and effect, you can't say that human beings are free, because everything is determined by cause and effect. And so you have actions, but those actions have some preceding causes influence in them. So you have a determinism and a fatalism, and that's, you have the forces of nature and you have scientific laws and behavior. And so if science, the hard sciences are the only thing that's real, and the laws of cause and effect are the only thing that's real, then as B.F. Skinner once said, if you take the laws of the physical sciences and apply them to human behavior, you have to assume that human beings are not free. Well, Heschel made the argument in his book that freedom comes from the act of transcendence, the religious act of transcendence, the ability of the individual, the human person, to transcend the conditions of phenomenal existence, of everyday phenomena of cause and effect, and relate to this reality that transcends that. And that's where freedom comes from, is that human ability, that religious ability to transcend. It's where we get freedom from. And that basically is the real philosophical, moral, religious, whatever you want to call it, core of the understanding of human rights. Because we have a destiny that allows us to transcend, we are not just mere phenomena of nature that our existence is determined in fatalistic ways. So human beings are essentially free in their core of their existence, because we are religious beings. We have the ability to transcend. Now, we're not free in every sense of the word, but only in the sense that we can transcend. And that's what Heschel is arguing. This argument probably came out, is seen as a Western construct, because it was gained its most prominent political expression in Western civilization. Although I would argue that if you really look closely at early civilizations, you're going to find hints of it too. And the idea that it's just a Western idea, I don't think is completely accurate. And we'll be looking back into, we'll look into that further. But this is not a materialistic scientific idea, because, like I said, B.F. Skinner said, again, I can't emphasize this enough, that if you want to apply the disciplines of the physical science to human behavior, you have to assume that human beings are not free. So the argument is that the Western idea of human freedom and human rights being a materialistic, anti-spiritual argument is absolutely ridiculous. It's the other way around. It's the materialistic argument is ignoring and rejecting the metaphysical foundations upon which the notion of human freedom rests. And so therefore, not only is it attacking other civilizations, it's attacking its own civilization. So what we have now, and this is where it got to, because of this idea of, oh, you can't have a claim for universal values if you're going to have diversity and tolerance. Okay, we're going to look at that assertion a little bit. You have what is called an assault on truth. You have truth claims in the name of trying to impose your ideas on others, but you don't really have truth. And I want to where this assault came from. One is comes from a justification of people like Gramsci and Alexander Dugin and people like that who are want to see some other thought system prevail. And so they talk about imperialism, they talk about imposing their views on others. And quite frankly, if they had the chance to impose their views on other people, they'd be fine with that. So that, I want to take a look at where some of this idea of, in the name of tolerance, you're proposing a viewpoint of relativism. There is no such thing as universals. The universals come about as an attempt to impose your views on others. Now, you start out with religious ideas in certain, especially if those religious ideas are united with the state, the union of church and state, or mosque and state, or temple and state, or synagogue and state, or whatever religious institution united with the state has allowed the certain religious views to be imposed upon others. So you have a backlash against that. And you also have a popular understanding of religion that some people consider to be superstitious, that the educated elite will react to. So you have a backlash against the church in the name of, and you have a backlash against the popular understanding of religion, and you have the advances of science, and you get to the point where you say, look, we have, this is in Western civilization, we have developed all of these technological marvels because of the physical sciences. And our society is not advancing with the same degree of certainty. We solving all these technical problems with the hard sciences. So why can't we solve human problems of human society with the hard sciences? Get rid of all these religious superstitions and will. And so you had the assault on truth started with an assault on religious truth. That religion is a matter of preference, is a matter of superstition. That truth comes from science, and that science is a approach to truth, and religion is mere opinion at best, and not a very educated opinion at that. So the idea that you can have compatibility between religion and science was under attack. And now you have the only truth is the truth of the physical sciences. And that came about, that was all different viewpoints brought this about, and the ones who pushed it the heaviest were the Marxists with their dialectical materialism, and the economic determinism was brought about, and then all ideas of transcendent reality, the notion of transcendent reality has to be destroyed or undermined. So after a while, that this idea started to become unappealing to people in the human sciences, because they didn't like the idea that, well, if you're going to apply the disciplines of the physical sciences to human beings, then you have to accept that humans are not free. So people in the literary and the arts, fields of literature and arts, they didn't like that. And they started to develop there was a Jacques Diderot, I forgot his name, French philosopher, thinker, literary critic. They came up with a discipline, although whether it's not really a philosophy so much as a discipline of literary criticism. It's called postmodernism. And in addition to, as that was coming about, or maybe prior to that, you had some advances in science that made people question just how cut and dry the sciences were as we moved from Newtonian physics into the Einstein's theories of relativity, and you had, well, time and space are relative to the observer. Well, it's not as cut and dry as you think it is. Then you had Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can't measure both the position of a particle and the direction it's traveling in, speed, with any precision. One, you can measure one or the other, or whether or not a particle behaves as a wave or a particle at the subatomic level, quantum level. And then finally in mathematics, you had Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where there are things we know to be true, but we can't prove it within our mathematical system. It's that mathematics is a blind spot, and any mathematical system that has sufficient sophistication to be useful can't prove its own consistency. And so you can prove that A equals B and A does not equal B at the same time in a sophisticated mathematical system. So he's not saying that mathematics is useless. He was a great mathematician and logician. He's just saying it has its blind spots. So you had these views, and these views were taken out of their context to say, look, it's not just religion that has a claim to truth, but it's not really truth. Science is too. There is no such thing as truth. The whole idea that you're going to impose truth on somebody is fallacious, because you don't have truth. Now, that's whether or not that's what postmodernism intended from the beginning is another issue, because they start out as literary critics and they're critiquing this claim to absolute truth. You have the truth. There's a difference between saying someone's claim to absolute truth is fallacious and can be chopped apart by literary criticism, and the idea that absolute truth itself doesn't exist. It's not saying the same thing, but and it's questionable what they really meant. But as time went on, what Pope Benedict referred to as a dictatorship of relativism came about. In order to be, moral relativism became the modern criteria for diversity and tolerance. You had to believe in moral relativism. You couldn't believe in a claim for truth. Now, I want to go into the reason why this is ridiculous. And two of the best critiques of this is Pope John IV. I'm not Catholic, but I think these two people are brilliant. One was a philosopher and one was a theologian. They're former popes. One was Pope John Paul and one was Pope Benedict. Pope John Paul wrote about truth as the ground of freedom. He also wrote this crisis of humanism. The biggest problem we have in the modern world is the crisis of humanism, our understanding of the human person. Again, this idea that truth is relative, or that truth can only can only be pursued through the physical sciences. That if you don't apply to physical sciences to human behavior, you got to believe it true. People are not free. So our understanding of the dignity of the human person, according to Pope John Paul, who was the originator of this Polish personalism, the dignity of it, he particularly wanted to push what he called Christian personalism. But this has to do with the dignity of the human person. And his argument is that our culture, our civilization, or civilizations, or whatever you want to call it, diversity, global civilization, human civilization, or the various different civilizations, the biggest crisis we have is the crisis of humanism. We don't understand the proper understanding of the dignity of the human person. And without that proper understanding, we're going to have dictatorship. We're going to have problems. We're never going to overcome dictatorship, because we don't understand the philosophical and metaphysical foundations of it. Pope Benedict, coming at this from a different view, he was not less of a philosopher than he was more of a theologian, but he was some considered the most brilliant person on the planet. And he wrote about the dictatorship of relativism. And that you're going to have, if you get rid of the notion of truth and you focus upon relativism, you will not have the philosophical ground to assert human truth. And in that vacuum, you're going to have the dictatorship. And this is a very long, old classical idea. It goes at least as far back as Plato's Republic. And back further, you can probably find this in a lot of different thoughts. You're going to find, I would say, Taoism would have some similar idea in it. If you don't go according to the Tao, everything's going to mess up, and you're going to govern. A political entity should be governed like frying a small fish, very lightly. If you don't follow the way of life according to the Tao, you're going to have a heavy-handed government, because you're not going to be able to go according to human nature. And that is Chinese philosophy. And I think you can find elements of that in many different cultures. Now, one argument that was being made in Plato's Republic, you had this sophists. The sophists were traveling intellectuals who taught these courses in rhetoric and how to convince people of your viewpoint. And one of the foremost sophists was a gentleman by the name of Thrasymachus. And he, like the other sophists, had traveled around the ancient Greek world and visited the many little city-states. They had these different little city-states, and he started to realize that you had all these differences. Each one thought they had the truth, but they're all differences, so there couldn't be an absolute truth. Yeah, it's a matter of opinion. Sounds like the arguments we're having today. And so, but he didn't conclude that we should have tolerance and get rid of truth claims, because taking this idea that morality is relative, and that everybody's view is different. You like chocolate, this person likes vanilla. And so the modern, well, we should be tolerant. You let people have what they want. And his argument, no, tolerance is a virtue. If morality is relative and truth is relative, then justice necessarily is the advantage of the stronger. Why have tolerance you are just, if there is no universal values that are true because we are human and not relative to our culture and relative to a truth claim, then justice is the advantage of the stronger. Might makes right, the law of the jungle, the idea that you're going to have, that moral relativism is going to lead to tolerance and diversity is absolutely absurd. It's ridiculous. It's the law of the jungle. And Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher in Germany, late 19th century philosopher, he talked about the death of God, and he talked about in European civilization how, and I talked about earlier with Antonio Gramsci and others, that wanted to get rid of these religious notions and these values and these that came from religion because they're superstitious, and we're going to build this new civilization based upon scientific truth and get rid of this transcendent idea of God. Well, Nietzsche, he was an atheist, so he didn't believe in God, but he did understand. He was educated enough about the historical foundations of Western civilization to realize what's going to happen if you did this. And he wasn't necessarily against it. He just wanted to, okay, let's really look closely at what we're doing here. The whole notion of justice of Western civilization is based upon the Judeo-Christian foundation, what he refers to as slave morality, as opposed to master morality. You had this, particularly Jesus, turn the other cheek, pray for those who persecute you, do good to those who hate you, whatever. This he referred to as slave morality, as opposed to the ancient pagan master morality, is, impose your will. The fundamental drive of human nature is the will to power, the will to conquer, and this is where. So he was saying that what we're going to have in Western civilization, and he was saying this at the end of the 19th century, you get rid of the notion of God, and you get rid of the distinction between man and animal, because God was supposedly created man in his own image, and therefore we don't operate according to the survival of the fittest, or kill or be killed. We are products of a creative act of free will, and we are created in the image, so therefore we have divine dignity. And so there's, according to Nietzsche, what's going to happen now, you're going to have a breakdown of value systems, and you're going to have wars like you've never seen before, where people are going to rise up against each other, and it's almost biblical in its expression as to how this is going to happen. And you're going to have people who rise up against people, and you're going to have nation against nation, and you're going to have the emergence of the Superman, Ubermensch, who's going to impose this will to power upon people. And you're going to recreate a value system based upon this master morality. And this is what Hitler was trying to do, is what Stalin was trying to do, and it's what you had in the early part of the 20th century. You had these world wars. And Nietzsche would say, I told you so. We're going to work it out. Well, now you have, the world wars are over, but the philosophical, if Nietzsche's right, the metaphysical foundation that gave rise to them is not finished. And so we have a situation now where the world is, these old foundational ideas are coming up, and that's what former Pope Benedict was called dictatorship of relativism. You're going to have this, people wanting to create this master morality. You got Putin, Russia, you got China, you got and you got all these some people, the idea that you're going to impose democracy upon people without them having a understanding of a value system that transcends it's not realistic. The democratic tradition, and we'll get into this in a minute, rests upon a culture It recognizes transcendence as a cultural moral prerequisite for human freedom. Now I want to go into one last example of this critique of Western civilization, and then I want to Said Qutb, who was the guru for the jihadi thinkers, and he critiqued Western civilization, which he correctly saw as found resting upon the Judeo-Christian foundation. And my argument was, although Western culture, modern culture rests in natural rights understanding rests upon Judeo-Christian foundation, the Judeo-Christian foundation itself is not primarily Western. It was an Eastern phenomena that planted in Western soil and grew to, and we'll get into that in a minute. So he's arguing that the problem with Western civilization is that it separates the sacred from the secular, and it focuses upon the hereafter rather than the here and now, and it leaves non-religious people in charge of the here and now, and so therefore you're going to have dictatorship because you have, you know, if you're going to have materialistic philosophy, it's going to lead to a lack of freedom. So he is under the Western civilization has no soul, and because the Judeo-Christian foundation led to a split between secular and sacred, between science and religion, and between faith and reason, and ultimately between church and state. So he was saying that, well, Qutb did not fault them for a pretense of universalism. He was simply arguing that universalism was on a faulty foundation, and that Islam constitutes that universalism that needs to be accepted if we are going to have a true human freedom. If you're going to have a civilization with a soul, it's going to be based upon Islam. Now, I want to take a look at his question, because we have 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, 1.5, something like that. There's quite a few Muslims in the world. And I have some friends in Indonesia from the East Indies form of Islam. And they are trying to promote their own version of Islam that they think is more compatible with human freedom. And I think they had a point. It's very similar to Sufi Islam. And they would take issue with Qutb and some of his thinkers, some thinkers who follow that line. And so I'm going to try to humbly critique Qutb myself, and hopefully I can be corrected. I'll send the video to my friends in Indonesia, and they can correct me where I need to be corrected. But okay, Qutb studied in Western universities, and if you look at his argument, he is writing this argument. He makes it very clear for what he calls the vanguard. The vanguard is a Leninist term. It's like the Communist Party was the vanguard. You're not going to have a revolution where the people are going to automatically rise up. You're going to have a vanguard that's going to lead them and impose a dictatorship. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Marx, eventually he wants the abolition of the state, but in the meantime, you're going to have a dictatorship of the proletariat, of the workers. So you have, in order to get to freedom, you have to have a dictatorship first. Hello. Yeah, they're going to give up their dictatorship and let us be free once they get there. Yeah, right. No, it's absolutely insane, and I can't believe this. Intelligent people believe this. So you're going to have a vanguard, an Islamic vanguard, that is going to politically impose Islam upon people, even though Quib admits in the Quran it says there is no compulsion in religion. Yet you're going to have a vanguard that's going to politically impose it upon people. Now he makes the argument that if you take law, human-made law, and you legislation, and you impose it upon people, then what you're having is a rule of man over man, not the rule of God. So you might have a point there, but what if you take someone's interpretation of law, of God's law, because he's saying man's got to be ruled by God's law, not man's law, in order for us to truly be free, because it's got to be transcendent, and freedom comes from transcendence. Well, if you're going to impose it upon someone, you have an executive function. If human beings are not capable of exercising a legislative function when it comes to law, then why do we think they're capable of exercising the executive function, which in some ways is even more in a judicial function? So someone's got to execute it. So you have, in what is referred to by some people as political Islam, these jihadists, they're trying to politically impose these ideas. So you're having supposedly the reign of human beings in the name of God. You're trying to talk about bringing about the reign of God. People will be free if they had God ruling over them directly. But what the jihadis are proposing is not that. It's the rule of a human being in the name of God. And it is in some ways more tyrannical than an atheist rule, because it doesn't admit that that's what they're doing. And so we're having the rule of God. So I want to take a look about the understanding behind some of his understanding of the Judeo-Christian interpretation of the split of secular and secular and the sacred. And I will admit that it does come off that way sometimes if you don't really look into it deeply. But basically, in biblical religion, you have God planting a garden and giving man dominion over creation and what is called stewardship. So there is a very fundamental biblical understanding of stewardship. So the things are not split up. But you also have a reality that, and I'm going to go into this in futures, there is a process by which you arrive at God's idea. There is a relationship between God and the individual. Then there is a communal relationship, and there is a process. And that process is there's a process of generation. And the fall of man can be referred to as degeneration. And the restoration of all of this is called regeneration. And now the American, the Puritans, they use this. I have a friend of mine who works with at a Reformed type church. It's a Baptist church, but the philosophy of the people who run it are Reformed. And we were talking about this idea of regeneration and how the problem with the for Christians is not the idea that you want to restore what's going on earth. The idea that political salvation, you can politically create salvation without regeneration of the human being, the human person. There is a process that needs to go on. There is regeneration. You have generation, which is Genesis, the development of human life. And what we refer to as evolution is really generation. The generation of over time of the expression, God's presence, God's divine presence becomes present in creation and brings life to it. God's breath blows into human beings and they become a living being. So it's generation in a sense of generating life, or animation. What animates human life? What animates us to strive into? What brings life to all what brings about life? There is a principle of generation. And that's what Christianity looks and the biblical religion looks at. And then you have the opposite when people fall away. The word sin comes from the word, has a connotation of missing the mark. You miss the mark, and then if that mark is the ground of your being, then you have degeneration, your corruption, the opposite, death and decay and all kinds of problems, stuff like that. So in order to bring back that idea, you have to have regeneration. Your regeneration starts in the heart and soul of the human person. And then it comes through community, through it is a long process. And there's something referred to as a utopian temptation where you try to impose it upon society and you create dictatorship. And I would argue that there are some interpretations of the biblical story was saying that's exactly what the forces of the other side tried to do. And if you read Augustine's City of God, he talks about City of God versus City of the World. And this is exactly what the problem. So the problem is not that Christianity separates the sacred and the secular. The problem is Christianity focuses upon the regeneration. The salvation of the individual comes first. But that salvation is a regeneration, is regeneration of the individual. And the regeneration of the individual leavens society and regenerates society. So you cannot shortcut it. It's like short-circuiting this process. It doesn't work. And I'm going to go into this in the future video. So the reason, and you can't impose morality has to be freely chosen. We are moral agents. We have freedom. That's why you have 10 commandments. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not, thou shalt. Well, that gives the implication that your choice determines your destiny to a certain extent. You follow the recommendations of what God's commands, and you're going to be prosperous, and you're going to generate. You reject them, and you fall short of the mark, and you're going to degenerate. You're going to have corruption. You're going to have all kinds of mess. So it's called moral agency. And so you're either in line with God's desire, original plan of creation, or you're not. And that's what, if you read Augustine's City of God, you have this fundamental dynamic going on. And the history of the world has been a history of civilization since trying to create God's idea on their own terms. A city of the Tower of Babel being probably one of the earliest examples on a societal, civilizational, worldwide level. And that's what happens. Almost every dictatorship, communism, fascism, socialism, Nazism, jihadism, they're all trying to do the same thing. You're trying to impose their idea of utopia without going through the proper regeneration from the individual to the community, and finally you have this idea is restored, the Garden of Eden restored. Now, I want to go into I said Christianity was an Eastern religion. And when I say Eastern religion, I'm talking about the area of Mesopotamia and the Near East and Middle East. And it shouldn't be, it's controversial subject because we know Christianity gave rise in Europe, but that's because it fell apart in other places. It wasn't just in early Christianity. You came out of Jerusalem. It started going east actually as fast as soon as it went to Rome. And you went to the Persian Empire. Christianity is a product of Second Temple Judaism, they built the Second Temple after they came back from the Babylonian captivity. And the Second Temple Judaism believed in the God's presence can be experienced in the individual human being in the here and now, not completely. It's going to be fully in the afterlife, but to a certain extent, you can experience the presence of God in the here and now. And this is what is referred to as an apocalypse. Now, the apocalypse in popular understanding is what happens at the end of time. This external wars are happening, but they didn't see it. Yeah, it might be certain to a certain extent, but the apocalyptic thought at that period was beyond time. So therefore, if you look at the apocalyptic literature in Christianity and Judaism, it's full of symbolism. And it's talking about the human struggle of good versus evil. And it's a lot of it's internal. And a lot of there's a lot of symbolism. And I've talked about this before, and I'm running a little bit late, but so the early Christians spoke Aramaic. And you had the earliest Christians spoke Aramaic, the language of Jesus and his disciples. And they spread out and they came to Rome. They came in a east, west, north, south. They're going all over the place, all kinds. If you look at the Acts of the Apostles, and when they had the Pentecost, and then they had all these different languages from these different countries. They were from all over the place, and a lot of them weren't Western. You look at the Revelation. He's speaking to the churches who are in Asia, because a lot of them were from Asia. St. Paul went to Rome, but a lot of his churches were east of Rome. And a lot of Paul's followers, they went eastward. And at one point, there was more Christians to the east of Baghdad, and Baghdad's in Iraq, which is considerably east of what we call Europe. But there was more Christians at one point to the east of Baghdad than there was to the west, because you had the Independent Church of the East, Aramaic-speaking Independent Church of the East. It traveled all the way. There's some books that people should read. There's the Jesus Sutras, By Foot to China. There's a bunch of books about the history of the Christian Independent Church of the East. There was neither under Byzantine rule or Western Roman rule. They never had control of that particular state, and so their approach to religion was very complementary. Later on, Islam, Islam came about as partially as a dialogue with Jews and partially as a dialogue with Christians, and they were accepting certain points and rejecting other points. And we can talk about that then, but the Independent Church of the East had a dialogue with Persian Zoroastrianism, with Buddhism, with Taoism, and they had some influence in the spread of dialogue between Buddhism and Taoism and Christianity, and this eventually gave rise to what is called Zen Buddhism. And actually, some Christian thinkers had a role in that. And it is a topic that is too broad to go into right now, but I would make the argument that Christianity spread east long time before it spread west, and that eventually the civilizations, it had a certain amount of success, pretty successful, but then other forces rose up that kind of depressed it. And in the Western civilization, when you had the collapse of the Roman Empire, you had the acceptance of Christianity by the Gauls and by these different people from the forests of Northern Europe coming down. When you see the collapse of the Roman Empire, and they accepted Christianity. So Christianity became a union of Jewish metaphysics, Greek philosophy, Roman universalism in terms of institutions. You had the Roman Senate and stuff like that. Was the Roman legal system. It didn't matter where you came from, you could become a Roman citizen. Greek philosophy believed in universal values. Jewish metaphysics, all men are created in the image of God. These believed in universal values. So the people from the tribes of Northern Europe and the forests of Northern Europe, when they came down and became the new rulers of this civilization, which became Christian civilization, adopted that. And so they implemented their own stories and stuff with it too. But Western civilization be, grew out of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And so the reason why Christianity had a chance to rebuild the Christianity rebuilt Western civilization from the ground up, because it was, you had dark ages for a while, and then you had the collapse of the Roman Empire, and you had the invasion of these northern tribes that weren't very literate, but they had some characteristics that made them capable of advancing freedom. So, but they, to a large extent, embraced Christianity. And you had this struggle going on between church and state and stuff like that, which eventually gave rise to the American idea of separation of church and state. And separation of church and state really is the separation of force from persuasion. The democratic tradition needs to have a distinction between culture, which is based upon values, and values are freely chosen, and politics, which is imposed upon people, and your rights are protected from theft and harm and stuff like that through the state. But the state is not the society. And as the Judeo-Christian tradition always had this distinction in germ, in seed, and it gave political expression in American separation of church and state, and that is why we had that. So next time I want to talk about this crisis of truth. I want to talk about how the scientific tradition and the religious tradition go together, and how you had this synthesis of the two in Western civilization, and I want to look at the rise of the concept of consciousness as the way to bring the two together. So, but that will be the next time we have our show. I'm not sure when it's going to be, but this so far has been, I know I've gone on farther than I'd like to. And so I will sign off now, and I'll see you next time on Operation City and Hill. Thank you, and have a nice